Global Indian Network. Print, TV, events, podcasts. Find out more at globalindianseries.com.
Welcome back to the Global Indian Podcast, home to the greatest conversations and the official platform for people of Indian origin. Yes, let's face it, we are everywhere. Now, you know, every single week we plunge into the human experience behind our perceptions of identity, take a second look at the countries we now call home, and tackle the big conversations. Well, earlier this week, I received a very interesting WhatsApp voice note. Here you go.
I thought of you and the Global Indian Series podcast, where I've been a guest as well previously. I'm reading this amazing book these days. It's called Sindh, Stories from a Lost Homeland, and it's by this Indian writer called Saaz Aggarwal, and she writes about stories from the lost homeland, which is Sindh, pre-partition and post-partition, and a lot of the interesting stuff that I don't think I've seen anywhere. She would be an amazing guest on the Global Indian Series, and I think you should get in touch and invite her.
So I took it upon myself, listening to our audience out there, to hunt down the incredibly talented and famous Saaz. And it was tough. But finally, I got a hold of her. Now, for those who are not initiated, Saaz is one of the most prolific writers across the whole of India. She has written a plethora of books looking at partition, about Sindhi culture, and is one of the most down-to-earth humour columnists that you can ever meet. I reached out to her in her home in Pune, and we had a really open, frank discussion about the other side of partition. Now, this all comes on the back of a film that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which is called the Kashmir Files. And it got me thinking, well, you got the Kashmir Files, and now people are saying they're going to be doing the Gujarat Files, there's going to be the Partition Files. I think everybody's going to be doing files quite soon. But how much do we know about the human impact that these have, the real human stories that have actually really not been showcased in modern media? As always, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all our dear sponsors and supporters out there, many of which you hear from soon. And if you too would like to be part of the world's greatest discussions, our very own 50 Shades of Brown conversations, well, it couldn't be easier. Come to the website. It is www.globalindianseries.com. Until we kick off, let's go to the news. So let's kick off with Portugal, home to over 70,000 people of Indian origin. Portugal's Azores archipelago was hit by over 1,100 earthquakes in just over 48 hours. Quakes ranged from 1.9 to 3.3 on the Richter scale, with incredibly only 63 being felt by the local population. Over to Argentina, where over 3,000 people of Indian origin call home. Behind the wall of steel barricades erected to keep protesters out, the Senate of the country has approved a highly controversial deal to refinance the country's $45 billion loan with the IMF. And over to Suriname, a country of over 150,000 people of Indian origin. Suriname has signed an MOU with Brussels aimed at promoting consular and migration policy cooperation and channeling the movements of people between the country as well as the Schengen region. This is of particular interest to the Caribbean region such as St. Lucia, Antigua, St. Kitts, Dominica, and of course Grenada, who look to hold emergency talks with the EU in its respective citizenship via investment program. And finally, Poland, with over 4,000 people of Indian origin, with a large community of the Sikh and Sindhi community within its capital. All eyes are within the region, as the country has taken more than 2 million people fleeing from violence from Ukraine. The country continues to see a steady Western reinforcement on its eastern flanks. There are now causes of direct concern that there would be a World War III.
Hi, my name is Divya, and I'm co-founder of the Global Indian Podcast. Before you get to today's show, I've got a quick favour to ask. If you've been enjoying our conversations, I'd love if you could take just 1 minute to leave us a review on the platform that you're listening to us on and share our work to friends and family. It helps us out a lot. Word of mouth is the primary way that we grow. Thanks for your continued support.
Hi, my name is Nestor Alfred, CEO of St. Lucia Citizenship by Investment. Think freedom. What comes to mind? Freedom to explore, to travel to any destination for work or play. Or is it freedom of expression? Being surrounded by the globally minded, those who care for society and environment. Every year, people from around the world apply for St. Lucian citizenship because they realize that real freedom is based on choice. Discover more about St. Lucian citizenship and how it's helping global Indians achieve more.
My name is Chitra Stern, and I am a proud Global Indian Ambassador and CEO of Martiniale Resorts and Martiniale Residences. We pride ourselves on the journeys that define a community, and our developments bring people together. Did you know that over 70,000 people just like us call Portugal home? The Global Indian journey has brought people together in a meaningful way, and on behalf of all of us at Martiniale, we want to thank you for joining us in these remarkable conversations. We look forward to seeing you here in Lisbon post-COVID. Have a great day.
And just move. Get up and just move. Get up and just move. Get up and just move.
So I'm a writer. I've been a writer ever since I was quite young, but I never studied the humanities. So there are some gaps in my in what I do, and in the sense that I studied my master's degree was in mathematics, and I actually was a lecturer in maths at a college in Bombay. That was my first job. And then when I actually turned to being a writer, I did many things. I wrote columns for Bombay papers. I was a humor columnist. I wrote book review columns. And over a period of time, I began to specialize. I realized that I have specialized in working with people to help them write their memoirs. And then it's because I asked my mother to tell me about a certain part of her life that we'd never heard about before. We knew that her family had been through partition. She was 13 years old at the time when they had to leave their ancestral homeland. And she was at that time probably in her mid-70s. So I said to her, I do this for everyone. Why don't you tell me your story and let me write it down? And the plan at that time was that we would just do this for our family, select photos from the cousins and, put it together and make a book. So she started talking, and a few things that happened. One is that I was really surprised that she could remember so much. She was, as I said, just 13, and she hadn't spoken for 65 years, but or maybe more than 60 years. There were things, and she, the fact that people remember things after decades, even though they've never spoken about them. Maybe she'd been thinking about them. Maybe the thoughts would come to her mind, and, she'd just never say anything, including things like she remembered the date on which their ship arrived in Bombay. She said our ship arrived in Bombay and it was the 14th of November. So that was really surprising to me, and very moving also. And then I also realized that there's so many interesting things in the story. There are things here that none of us know, and we should know, because when my mother was Sindhi, so at that time when, there was hardly any documentation about the Sindhi diaspora. And I realized that these stories are just fantastic. And, people like we have a perception of Sindhis, which is so unidimensional. And there's such a richness in this, what she's telling me. So that's when I started, this became bigger than just her story. I started interviewing people. I started reading books. I was very lucky, it was like someone was sitting up there, perhaps my grandfather or my grandmother, or maybe both of them, sending the right people my way to tell me amazing stories about, like, for example, just completely by coincidence, a friend of mine, her father, when he was a young boy, he was in a boarding school near Nasik, And a group of them was sent to a refugee camp nearby where the Sindhi refugees were coming in. And they had no idea what Sindh was. I mean, they'd heard the name Nehru and Gandhi, but they didn't know anything. They were just these like 12-year-old or 13-year-old boys. And they were sent there to do an administrative job because these refugees were pouring in, and these boys just had to meet each person who was coming in and write down their name. And they taught them 4 or 5 sentences of Sindhi, which my friend's father, when I interviewed him, he said those sentences to me. He could still remember, things like Tunjo Nalo Chai, which is, what's your name? And they would ask them, what's your father's name? What's your mother's name? Or they'd ask, what's your husband's name, your wife's name? Everybody's names had to be written down, and perhaps their ages also. And, the scenes of the trains full of people, all dressed in white. And of course, they were not wearing white because they were mourning or anything. It's because in those days, the cheapest fabric was white cotton. And they were coming in hordes, and they were staying in very, very, very difficult conditions. It was very crowded, not clean. He told me that he could remember this gentleman who had been a French professor in Sindh, and he was frying tikkis and selling them to the other refugees to help feed his family. I mean, they all had to do something, right, to sustain themselves. So, so I got a number of interesting stories. I read stuff to give me an idea of what the history had been like. And then that's how I wrote my first book. And again, the first book, I didn't really bother going and looking for a publisher and stuff like that because, as I told you, my mother remembered the date on which the ship arrived in Bombay, and that was like about 3 months away. And I decided I'm going to put this book together myself.
Yeah,
and we'll launch it on that date. And I will, we'll have this party for our family, for her cousins, and people who I didn't even know. Actually, I'd hardly met any of her cousins.
when we look at this notion of identity, it's complex in itself, but we are based upon the stories in which we are exposed to. So what is the identity of Sindhiness to you? What does it mean to you?
It's such a difficult question that you've asked me because, if you look at the Sindhis of Sindh in the way before partition, look at the 1920s or the 1930s. You look at the Hindus of Sindh at that time, and they were a community that spoke the Sindhi language. They had started learning English because at that time, Sindh had come under the British Empire. The British entered Sindh and annexed it to their empire in 1843. So after that, the identity was still very much Sindhi, with a certain land, a certain, the religion was, even whatever your religion was, the focus was on spiritual values. It was not on a particular religion. So whether you were a Hindu or a Sikh or a Muslim, you respected spirituality, you respected, high thinking and good ways of behaving. So that was a part of your identity. So even if you were a Hindu, you followed Guru Nanak, and actually most of the Hindus, a very large percentage of the Hindus of Sindh were really Sikh. They were followers of Guru Nanak. Their rituals were Sikh rituals. They didn't consider themselves Sikh because they didn't follow the 5Ks. Although many families would give one son to the Sikh religion officially, and he would wear a turban and have a beard. And many of the Hindus also had their own family peer, which would be this Muslim religious leader. Not really leader. I mean, leader then becomes a political thing. So just you can say saint. Again, saint is a word with so many different kind of shades, but you know what I mean. They'd have a Muslim spiritual seeker or poet or wanderer who they would go to for a feeling for spiritual support, or when they had bad times, or when they needed, somebody to help them, go through a difficult phase, or just because they enjoyed that feeling of being in that community where everybody was aspiring to that higher goal. But it wasn't so. As Sindhi identity, you were not really so. So then when partition came, then your Hindu identity became really important, because you didn't, late at that point when partition took place, Sindh was not partitioned, and the Hindus were never going to leave. Hindus had always been, for hundreds of years, Hindus had been a minority in Sindh, but they were very comfortable. They had their own place. There was one community which had taken to education, and they worked in the administration. They were professionals. They were teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers. And there was another community much larger who were traders, and they were trading at various different levels. You had the village tradings, the banya shops, banyo shops, and then you also had the big international traders who had actually started way before partition took place. Soon after 1843, like I told you, the British came in, and they came in with their own trade cartels. They came in with their own, networks, and they even brought in the company rupee. So it became a difficult thing for the traders of Sindh. And they had to find, they did pretty soon recover. When they knocked out the princes of Sindh, they had actually destroyed the biggest customers that they had. So they had to start all over again. And then they realized that the British love in the Sindhi handicrafts. So they started selling them the Sindhi handicrafts. And then they realized the British are actually buying trunkfuls and taking them when they go off on their home leave. So they followed, a group of young men actually filled up their own trunks, steamer trunks, and hopped onto these ships, and then went off. And, from Karachi to Bombay, Bombay to Aden, Aden to Cairo, and then Gibraltar, and then the Canary Islands, and then on the east as well. I mean, they were going from Calcutta to Rangoon and blah, 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 all around the world. The first Sindhi merchant arrived in Puntarenas, which is in the south of Chile near the South Pole, in 1907, and his family is still there. So this trading community, they were doing this. They also had a money trade, which was not it was not a sea route, it was an overland route. So that was going from the interior of Sindh right into Central Asia, China, Japan, Russia, and on the west through the Gulf and Iran and Iraq. So they were comfortable, and they had their own culture. And again, then when partition took place, the identity, the components of the identity changed. And then when they moved to other places, it was really important for them to integrate. They wanted their kids to have a good future. They started talking to their children in local languages, and they actually lost their language.
Well, what does it teach you about this whole pursuit of human identity? Because the Sindhi community for me is absolutely remarkable. I think I hazard to think which country I've been to where I haven't met somebody that's Sindhi. From the Caribbean islands, so from St. Lucia through to St. Kitts and the ports, you've got all the big Sindhi communities that are there. Yeah. In Sierra Leone, you have a large Sindhi community, Nigeria, all the way down through to Argentina. And so you've got this amazing community that have gone out there, and you tend to see people wearing a kara like this, and then they have a picture of Guru Nanak Dev Ji in their soul. And you think, it's amazing how they've had this kaleidoscope. But when you look at this small community that's gone across the globe in so many ways, it's not really the Sindhiness, but I guess it tells us something about what it means to be human. So amongst all these stories that you've been discovering, this notion of Indianness tends to come up, or Pakistaniness, whatever type of ism it is. But what have you learned about the fragility of the human behavior that have almost dictated these stories across the globe?
So that's a really difficult. So, I think when it comes to very difficult times, what do people want? All they want is they just want their comfort back. They want a secure future for their children. I don't think anybody's really looking at anything else,
Yeah.
So that's why when politicians say that, oh, Muslims are bad or Hindus are bad or whatever, it's just nonsense, because actually everybody's the same and everybody is just looking at this. You want the comfort of your life and you want a secure future for your children, and that's the bottom line. If you're talking about humanity, that's what everybody wants, and there's nothing else. There's nothing which is important. And the fact is that as a human being, you're so frail, you're so vulnerable. Anything can happen to you. Anything. You can be walking down the road and a flower pot can fall on your head, or you can wake up one morning and suddenly realize that the world is experiencing a global pandemic. You can lose, so you just look at doing things from day to day the best way that you can. I mean, there's nothing else, whether you're a Sindhi or you're not.
It's
That's
a mutual fragility that everybody goes through in the human form, and it's
and
common sense
you
is yeah.
you may be very successful, but that success is obviously not only because you're really smart. It's also because so many external factors.
What do you think is the biggest misconception people have about partition? Because I know we spoke about this off air, that many people look at the impact, the last part, the content, which is trains of bodies going back and forth. At the same time, everyone's waving flags of independence, but there's so much more to those human stories, aren't there?
Right. So in everyone that I have interviewed, without exception, have told me about how they were helped by members of the other community. And for me, that's the biggest story, that though we know that there was so much of violence and so much of murder and rape and kidnapping, abduction, whatever, we know that because those are the stories that always make the headlines. But the fact is that people were protecting each other, and they were doing that at the risk of their own lives and their own family safety. I cannot tell you how many stories like this I've heard, because everybody, even if they're not stories which are to the extreme, where my mom's cousin, they were in Karachi on the 6th of January. On 6th of January, 1948, a big pogrom took place in Karachi. Now, before that, Karachi had been relatively free of violence all through 1947. Yeah, there were some demonstrations, there were riots. I'm not saying there wasn't bloodshed. I'm not saying that, but it wasn't like those trains full of dead bodies that you see these carcasses lying on the road and vultures on the terraces. It wasn't like that. So my mom's cousin, he was also 13 years old, the same age as my mom, and he told me about how in the morning the neighbors came to see them, and they begged them not to leave the house. His elder brother was going to take his aunt out shopping, and they said, please don't leave the house today because there's going to be trouble. They knew it. And they came and they brought burqas from their home and they hung them in the balcony so that, it would be seen as a Muslim house. And when the mob came, they said, no, there's nobody here. There were Hindus, but they've all left, and now it's only Muslims. And these were not even so, I was telling you about the religious identity of the Sindhi, where the Hindus and Muslims, they did not really have that much of a difference because they respected each other's holy people. They respected each other's rituals. They participated in each other's festivals. So they could trust each other. But these were not. So when the actual trouble started, when outsiders came, outsiders who had left their own homes, and they must have faced the violence of partition themselves. So when they came, you couldn't really blame them. I mean, of course, you could blame them, but it couldn't be that surprising if they came with certain amount of vengeance and, those kind of feelings. So the people who protected them were the Muhajirs. It was a Muhajir family who had come from another place, from across the new border. And they were the ones who made sure that they were safe. So it's stories like this which you mentioned when we started, you mentioned the movie Kashmir Files. Now, I have avoided going to see it, though it's being talked about a lot, because people are saying that it's only giving one side of the story. And I find that disturbing because
Yeah.
I know from having talked to so many people, yes, everybody suffered. And my mother's family suffered a lot because they lost everything. And when I say everything, initially we used to, again, like I said, we started with this one dimension, unidimensional kind of thing of, oh yeah, they left their money and their property behind. And through the course of these interviews, I've realized it was much more than that. They left their language behind. None of us can speak. None of us, even the younger siblings, my mom's younger siblings who were born in Bombay, they can speak, but not, like my mom, though she was a kid, she used to read literature, she was a poet, and she lost that. I mean, she could never be a writer because she lost her language. She was educated in English after that. So they lost the language, they lost their culture, they lost their history. There were so many people in Sindh who built Karachi, who built Hyderabad. They were Hindus who built these places, and nobody remembers them. Nobody remembers them because after partition in Sindh, in all of Pakistan, the statues were pulled down and the records were destroyed, and the people who fled across the new border and lived in other places, why would they be recognized? They were just new people who'd come to stay, and nobody really, gave a thought to who they were. So there was this one person, Dr. Hemant, gosh, I've forgotten his name. I think his name was Hemandas Wadhwani. Now, he was a very well-known person in Sindh. He was a doctor who built a practice in Jacobabad, but he went way beyond that because he was involved in promoting maternal health. And he was also instrumental in setting up a medical college in Sindh. And the college is called the Dao Medical College. And I've seen, Dao was the governor of Sindh, so it was named for him. And I've seen a newspaper report quoting this person, Dao, that it should have been named after Dr. Hemandas instead of me because he did so much more to build it. And on the 14th of August, 1947, there were 16 gates, ceremonial gates, named after 16 celebrities or well-known people of Pakistan, and he was one of them. Okay, now after independence, he had to move. Now, none of these people actually wanted to move because that was their home. They were actually pushed out by the circumstances. They knew this is not their home anymore, and they were in danger. So he left with his family. Everybody left. Some of them left, many families left in a trickle. He was still a very good doctor. He lived with his parents and his children and his wife in Kulaba, which is south, it's a locality in South Bombay. And nobody just lived a simple life. And, people would come. There were refugee camps in Kalyan and in the suburbs of Bombay. So people who knew him in Sindh would come all the way in the train and, 2 hours to consult. And he started doing Ramayana Katha in his home. So this guy who was so prominent, he became, in his later years, nobody knew him except for his Ramayana Katha. So those are the kind of things that happened. It's very sweet, very sad, but that's how partition affected him and his family.
What have you discovered about yourself whilst uncovering all these stories? Because ultimately you're taking people's memories on, you're taking their experiences, but you start to see the world almost as it is rather than how you are, because you're redirecting your thoughts towards certain subjects. Like we've been through that with the travel and obviously the podcast, but what's it been like for you?
Gosh, Rajan, you're my therapist, aren't you? Yeah, so the first thing is that I started seeing my mother as a person,
Yeah.
even though I was pretty old when I got into this. I had never really understood that she's somebody who um, had been through this. I started realizing, I started seeing other parts of her life, which must have been equally very hard, and how she went through those phases. And I never had any sympathy for her before, but I mean, sympathy is not a very positive word, but I did start seeing her as a human being, which I think was kind of progress in my own personal development. I started feeling more connected to my ancestors, and I kind of became an ancestor worshiper in a way, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have, it's become my mission. It has been my mission for quite a while to record the stories and to pass them on in a positive way, to help people to connect with and I found so much which is so inspiring. Like, I'll tell you, like, I like a lot of Indian women who are in the same kind of socioeconomic situation like me. We don't do housework, okay? We don't do housework. That's the great thing about one of the great things about my life is I don't do housework. Somebody else helps me with that. And then a time comes when, for some reason, I have to part ways with my helper. In the past, it used to be, oh my God, it used to be totally traumatic. Oh, how am I going to cope? Because, I can't work. I'm extremely productive. And the reason for that is because I don't have to do any housework. All the energy can go into writing or,
You have that
painting or whatever I want to
focus.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can just do that. So now it doesn't bother me like that, because I remember this moment when it happened with somebody who I was really relying on. And then I realized now I have to let her go. And my heart didn't sink to the boots as it would normally have, because I remembered that, look at all these people. I mean, they lost everything and they just took a day at a time and they built it all back. What's wrong with me,
Yeah. It gives you a different perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, it just makes you realize that if you have a problem, then you need to just start thinking about how you're going to solve it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, what's your biggest fear? Because you've seen people's fears play out within their own lives, within their generations. As you rightly said, partitions being one, it's a loss of life. On the other side is a total dislocation of culture, language, traditions on the other. And these are very sentimental stories because they do revolve around life and death. And you can see the shifting sands of politics as well as those isms of divide. What's your biggest fear when you look back at these stories and addressing it to the present day?
I think that the fears, I mean, I can talk about fear as a possible negative scenario, but not really fear as a feeling of dread. So if you can allow me to use the, say that my fear could be that everything can change, that, for example, if India becomes a Hindu Raj, which we seem to be on the verge of becoming, those are the nasty things that could happen. But then again, I also would feel that it's fine, whatever happens, you don't really have any control, but what you need to do is keep doing what you're doing and keep going and be brave, which is how your ancestors handled it. Take a day at a time, do your best, and let things work out the way they're supposed to, because sometimes solutions they just come, they just happen, or they occur to you, or somebody helps you. There's always a way out of every difficult situation. Even if the difficult situation carries on for a while, eventually you're going to come out of it because things keep changing.
Yeah, I suppose there's that word of adaptation that people do. And what the Sindhis, in my opinion, have done really well is, in addition to adaptation, is adoption. They've actually engulfed the local personalities of the countries. I saw this amazing one on your website where you got this family, I think they went to Chile, And you've got this store there named after something, and nobody knows who the owner is, but it's very predominant. You can tell. So the influence that people are having within the community abroad, and how they're actually adapting to the humanness of the countries now. And the other part of it is that almost the Sindhi culture is a tapestry of the humanness that people have within those countries, or within Sindh itself, where you had the different religions that came together, even your language in itself. And then when they pick it up and they move, how again they start to adapt, that their religious tolerance is there. That's a remarkable thing.
Something that continues. And I don't know whether you saw, for example, like the Hindu temple in Malaga, which is, of course, they've got the Hindu gods, they've got the Sikh gurus,
but then you have Christ.
Got a lot of other, so that they still have that hasn't gone, and you see that in almost every Sindhi home.
Why is there such a big misconception about the Sindhis then? Because in India, there'll be stories of if you see a snake in a Sindhi, and these are really atrocious statements that people can make.
Not really, because, as a culture, we do kind of, point, are judgmental about other communities. So why is a very big question. One of the reasons is, I think, because there are stereotypes which are propagated in the Hindi movies. You see, these really business sharks, ruthless, unscrupulous, just exploiting people for money. And these kind of people will have Sindhi names and Sindhi accents. And it doesn't happen now because everything has changed. But when we were growing up, it was a thing. So that's one thing. The other thing is, historically, I mean, if you look at partition, okay, the Hindus who came, to actually grow, to make your mark in any place, it takes a lot of time. If you want to set up a practice and grow it, it's going to take you years. But trading is easier. You can trade, and the archetypal story of the Sindhi trader is he would sell his sugar at a lower price than anyone else, but he'd make a higher profit because after selling all the sugar, he would sell the sack also. Simple sustainability things like that. But what happened at partition is that suddenly every community had a new group of people trading. So the traders who were already there were under threat, right? They were trading at their margins. And then you had these newcomers who were really hungry, and it didn't matter to them what margins they would trade at because they had to eat and feed their families. So they became crooks. Simple. When you undercut an established business, you're a crook. And that's a story that takes a lot of, that's a perception that would take, I don't know what it would take to change that perception. So, but I'll tell you, I have read prejudicial statements about the Sindhis from way back. The colonial conquerors of Sindh, they were saying, I can't remember offhand right now, but you read Richard Burton and you'll read about how stupid the Sindhis are, or how, there are like adjectives and descriptions which are not very flattering. The sad thing is that even the Sindhis of Sindh after partition, things didn't go that well for them. Which again is something you might know, but we didn't know because there's this huge wall right between our two countries, and nobody really knows what's going on on the other side. So when I visited Sindh for the first time, which I did for the Oxford University Press published my first book, and I went along with my family to the Karachi Literature Festival where it was being launched. And that was the first time that it was amazing. Like I always say, for us, it was like a trip to the moon because it's so hard for an Indian to visit Pakistan. But it was a fabulous experience. And for me, it was like traveling in India. It didn't seem, like, I live in Pune. So when I go to Calcutta or when I go to Chennai or when I go to Delhi, people are different, right? They speak both. Whether it's Hindi or whether it's English, they speak it differently. People dress differently. The food on the streets is different. The way you engage is different. It was like that. It was like a regional difference.
Yeah.
Which is what it is actually. And even the language, right? You're speaking if you're speaking to each other, you call it Hindi, the other person calls it Urdu, because the language is that similar. The structure is the same. A lot of the words are the same.
They're Siamese twins, aren't they? And
no, the metaphor that I used in an interview that I did was that I felt like I was looking into the mirror into a mirror for the first time. And that is really what I felt, that is what I felt, because it was a absolutely overwhelming experience. We had so much of affection and I mean, I'm getting gooseflesh thinking about it now. The way we were treated, the hospitality that we received, the kind of affection and regard minute to minute that was being poured on us. It changed our lives really. So this whole thing with the political divide and that they are bad and we are good thing, it's rubbish, isn't it?
I think it's a great course of action that gives you votes, perception of power and influence, and maybe small-time validation. But if you separate human beings from each other, there's no good that can ever come from that. It benefits one, but never the whole community. And we all live on the same planet. How can you divide a planet up full of the same species?
What a fantastic conversation. I'm sure you agree. If you want to find out more about this subject, it couldn't be easier. Simply go to the website www.globalindianseries.com. Go to the search function and type in the word Sindhi. There you'll see loads of podcasts, loads of articles, original pieces, having a look at the history and the community right the way across the planet. Also, if you'd like to be part of these incredible conversations, make sure you use the Contact Us button there. I'd love to hear from you. If you're fortunate enough to be part of our personal WhatsApp broadcast list, well, you can ping me via back there. I'll be happy to have a conversation. Until next week, I hope all remains well, and I hope you enjoy continuing these brown stories from around the world. Until then, take care.
Global Indian Network. Print, TV, events, podcasts. Find out more at globalindianseries.com.